Before you start watching, I strongly recommend you to check out our videos on the War of Austrian Succession. That would be a great addition to a complete immersion in the upcoming conflict, which came as no surprise to its participants. After all, for several years, the grapes of upcoming war have been pouring and ripening, since after signing the Treaty of Aachen, almost all participants of the War for Austrian Succession were dissatisfied with its results. The Austrian Empire of Habsburgs wanted to regain their lost Silesia, and Great Britain, whose economy grew at a tremendous pace after the English Civil War that had taken place in it, strived for expanding its colonial possessions and dominate the sea. And only France interfered with the accomplishment of their plans. As for Prussia, after recent conquests, it had become one of the leading powers in Central Europe. And its neighbors naturally didn't like this. Surrounded by hostile powers, Frederick understood that he would soon have to defend the conquered territories and actively prepared for the upcoming battles. All these resulted in the last major conflict before the French Revolution, in which all the main powers of Europe participated. The fighting took place both in Europe and overseas, in North America, in the Caribbean, in India, and the Philippines. Since the main confrontation in Europe was between Austria and Prussia over Silesia, the 7 Years' War is also called the Third Silesian War. In Swedish historiography, the war is known as the Pomeranian War, in Canada as the War of Conquest, and in India as the Third Carnatic War. The North American theater of 7 Years' War is also known as the French and Indian War. And all these, one major conflict that famous Winston Churchill called the First World War. So let's try to understand the causes, events, and consequences of this conflict. Grab some tea and let's get started. The first firing of the 7 Years' War took place long before its official announcement, and not in Europe but beyond the seas. It was in North America that long-standing colonial rivalries between Britain, France, and Spain led to frequent border conflicts. The problem was particularly acute for the disputed territories in the Ohio River Valley. Let me tell you briefly what happened here. In 1754, Major George Washington, then barely 21 years old, was sent to the French to negotiate on the border affirmation. Washington, at the head of the Virginian Colonial Militia Detachment, was moving toward a French fort in the area of the modern city of Pittsburgh when he ran into a French detachment. In a firefight, one of the French officers was killed and Washington retreated back. When news of this incident reached Albion, the British decided to send a military expedition the following year to drive out the French. But the news of British preparations reached France, and Louis XV decided to immediately send 6 regiments to New France, with which they successfully fought off an attack of large British expeditionary force at the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. However, in the same year, the British, after a 2-week siege, captured the fort of Beausejour and also continued to attack French ships, contributing to the final official declaration of war. Yeah, at that time, the war between Great Britain and France had not been officially declared yet. And before that, I must quickly explain to you another very important point, which is known as the diplomatic revolution, or the reversal of alliances. As you remember from previous major conflicts, a stable system of alliances has developed in Europe. Britain has always supported Austria as a counterbalance to French expansion on the continent. And the French have always cultivated diplomatic relations with Bavaria and Prussia to lobby their interests within the Holy Roman Empire. But the results of the recent War of the Austrian Succession have become a clear manifestation of the crisis in international relations. The constant flow of British subsidies to Austria did little help to British, and their military intervention did nothing to save Silesia from being overrun by Prussia. In its turn, Prussia, having captured Silesia, came to an agreement and made peace with Austria, completely disregarding the interests of its ally France. It was clear to everyone that such a system of alliances was outdated. Therefore, George II, before officially declaring war on France, faced a very difficult choice. The fact is that he was passionately devoted to the continental possessions of his family. And even if successful in the colonial wars, French could easily capture Hanover, which would inevitably become a bargaining chip in peace negotiations to return the lost territories. It was necessary to protect Hanover, but the traditional ally Austria was little interested in the security of Hanover. For Maria Theresa, the main issue in foreign policy was the return of Silesia inevitably. For the Habsburgs, the main problem in the confrontation with Frederick was France, connected with Prussia by a treaty of alliance. It was decided to converge with Paris in hope of achieving the neutrality of France in the confrontation with Prussia, or even persuading them to provide assistance to Austria. In addition, a defensive alliance was signed with Russia, the real purpose of which was to shatter the power of Prussia. East Prussia was planned to be annexed to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In return, Russia was to receive the Duchy of Courland. Surrounded by hostile powers, Frederick was in a difficult position. Besides, his alliance with France was about to be terminated in June 1756, and he could not come to an agreement on a plan of action with Paris. He expected Louis to send troops to the Austrian Netherlands and Hanover so he could concentrate on his offensive to the south. The French, in their turn, insisted that he independently capture Hanover. Negotiations with French came to a standstill, so the Prussian king began to build relations with British. Frederick hoped that British influence could keep Russia from attacking. On the other hand, apart from Austria, France became the enemy of Prussia. But Frederick decided that using British subsidies, he was able to defeat his main continental opponents. Getting back to George II, in Great Britain, in order to protect Hanover, they decided to choose Prussia. It was all this long con, which historians later called the diplomatic revolution, destroyed long-standing alliances in Europe and created new ones, Anglo-Prussian and Austro-Russian-French. And on May 17, 1756, after almost 2 years since the start of hostilities in the colonies, Great Britain officially declares war on France. Meanwhile, the Prussian king didn't wait for a whistle for wind and decided to strike first. In August 1756, he invaded Saxony, the small German duchy that did not have powerful armed forces, could not resist the aggressive neighbor. Frederick received significant human and physical resources, a convenient base for an attack on Austrian Bohemia, from where, after wintering, he planned to invade Moravia and march on Vienna in order to quickly end the war. On the other hand, such aggressive actions of Prussia forced his opponents to harness their horses faster. In early 1757, Frederick again took the initiative into his own hands. The Prussian army, moving in 4 columns, entered Austrian territory in Bohemia. The 60,000-strong Austrian army, under the command of Prince Lorraine, was sent toward it, that was defeated on May 6th in the bloody Battle of Prague and was forced to fortify inside the walls of the city. The siege of Prague began. After the capture of the city, Frederick, without any delay, planned to go on Vienna. However, the Blitzkrieg plan struck a crippling blow. The 54,000-strong army came to the aid of besieged. On June 18, 1757, in the vicinity of the city of Courland, the 34,000-strong army of the Prussians entered into a battle with Austrians. Frederick lost this battle, losing 14,000 men and 45 cannon. The heavy defeat did not destroy the myth of invincibility of the Prussian commander, but more importantly forced Frederick to lift the siege of Prague and hastily retreat to Saxony. From this moment on, having a significant numerical superiority, the Austrians win a number of victories over Frederick's generals and capture main Silesian fortresses. Meanwhile, in East, the 70,000 French army invades Hanover and defeats the 30,000 Hanoverian army. The second 43,000 army of the French and Imperials, under the command of Charles, Prince of Soubise, approached Eisenach in August 1757, threatening to invade Prussia. In the north, the Swedes, seeking to regain their lost Pomeranian possessions in the past, land an army of 20,000 and occupy a number of small, poorly defended cities. In the east, an army of 65,000 under the command of Field Marshal Apraskin successfully invades East Prussia. With the support of the Baltic Fleet, they managed to capture Memel, as well as win the decisive victory in the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf. But despite these successes, the Russian army, unexpected for everyone, begins its retreat from East Prussia back to Courland. According to rumors, Apraskin was afraid that Empress Elizabeth, who was seriously ill at that time, could be replaced on the throne by Peter III. However, the Empress soon recovered and Apraskin paid with his freedom for his actions. Since the threat of invasion from east disappeared, Frederick immediately ordered his free units to return to Pomerania to protect it from the Swedes. They were able to quickly regain control of the region and block the Swedish forces in Stralsund. Frederick at this time put forward his main forces to repel the French invasion in the south, and on November the 5th, both armies met in the neighborhood of the village of Rosbo. It is important to note that despite the significant numerical advantage, the French were exhausted after a long march. Their units suffered from low discipline, and a quarter of the army were Reichsarmee, the combined forces of many imperial states, each of which sent its own commander. And there was no question of any cohesion in such a decentralized army. Frederick placed his forces between the villages of Bedra and Rosbach. He miscalculated a little before the start of the battle, believing that he had taken a very advantageous position and that the French imperial forces would not dare to give him a fight and would retreat. So he was just observing their maneuvers. The next morning, the Franco-Imperial army moved south. They planned rear attack, but their movement to the south only strengthened Frederick's confidence that they were retreating, and only when the French turned to the east, he realized that they were trying to outflank him. Understanding the danger of the situation, if the enemy completes its maneuver, he immediately sends cavalry to meet the foemen. Behind them, the infantry begins its maneuver to take up positions in front of the redistribution. The moment when the Prussian cavalry collided with the French, unexpected for everyone, on the top of Janus Hill, a squadron of 18 cannons sent by Frederick completed the deployment. Its volleys lit up the entire valley, deafening bombardment mauled the rank of approaching infantry force. When Frederick reached Redistribution with the main forces, the Prussian cavalry intensified their onslaught and they managed to push the French to the river. In the center, Frederick completed the formation of his infantry. The acute angle they positioned themselves in formed the perfect trap for the advancing enemy infantry. Tortured by heavy bombardments, they faced a horrific sight. Their cavalry was defeated in the south, and in the front of them were the Prussians who caught them in a trap. Prussia's infantry fired a devastating volley which greatly dragged down the French imperial forces. They barely resisted, answering with a few scattered salvos. But the attack of the Prussian infantry, supported by artillery, did its job. The enemy lines were melting before their eyes. As Frederick's infantry engaged in a fierce close-in battle, his cavalry finished fighting the renance of the enemy's cavalry and struck with a death-dealing attack to the right flank. A few minutes later, they wavered and began an exodus from the battlefield. As a result of this battle, the army of Frederick II lost at most 500 people. On the contrary, the French Imperial Army lost over 10,000 men, 11 generals, and about 260 officers. The Prussians also got 72 enemy cannons. Excited by such a glorious victory of the Ally, the British increased subsidies for Prussia. The French, after such an embarrassment, do not dare to continue the invasion from the east. They consider reducing their financial and military contributions to the coalition, confining themselves to their campaign in Hanover. In the meantime, Frederick did not have time for a break because the Austrians had already captured all the main fortresses in Silesia by that time and were preparing to attack his capital from there. Having averted the threat from the French, he immediately transfers all his forces to Silesia, where on December the 5th, just a month after the victory of Rosbo, his army was about to give revenge to the Austrians at the Battle of Leuthen. Despite the significant numerical advantage of the Austrians, Frederick could not believe his luck, because they had to fight in the very valley where the military exercises and training of his troops had recently taken place. When the morning mist cleared away, Frederick climbed to the top of the Schomberg Hill, part of the infantry and cavalry fortified in the Born village. From there, he could see whole Austrian forces whose formation stretched from north to south by approximately 8 kilometers. Significantly outnumbered by the Austrians, Frederick decided to use the tactics of so-called oblique order, concentrating all the strike on one flank of the enemy. Behind the cover of the hills, the Prussian columns, unnoticed by Austrians, began to move in the southern direction. The Prince of Lorraine, seeing the vanguard of Frederick in Born, decides that the main attack will be directed to his right flank and sends his reserves for the defense. By noon, the main forces of the Prussian army had reached Lobetins and began preparations for an attack against the Austrian flank. When Charles noticed enemy maneuvers on the left flank, he at first thought it was a distraction, but seeing the enemy forces arriving, he immediately sent a second line of infantry to the south to strengthen his left flank. Since it quickly got dark in this part in winter, Frederick could not waste any more time and gives the order to launch an attack. Outnumbered on this flank, his forces, with the help of precise artillery shots, begin to push through the enemy. Charles realizes that he will not be able to protect the southern flank with reserve forces and orders all his units to move south. The nearest units of the Austrian army came to the rescue and lined up in the area of Leuthen. The stiffest battles were centered inside Leuthen. After half hour of battle, the Prussians managed to capture the village. Due to the excessive stretching, the second front of the Austrian came to the rescue only after an hour and a half. The defining phase of the battle began, which did not last very long because after the attack of the cavalry from the flank, entire battalions threw down their weapons, fled or surrendered. The whole Austrian army chased away. In total, the Prussian forces lost 6,382 people. The losses of the Austrian exceeded 22,000 people, almost a third of the entire enemy. After such a defeat, the Prince of Lorraine resigned as a field marshal and Frederick regained control of Silesia. At the beginning of 1758, the Russians under the command of Firma, unchallenged, occupied all the East Prussia and head toward Berlin. Frederick immediately moved to intercept them. And on August 14th, one of the bloodiest battles of the 18th century took place near the village of Zorndorf. Having started in accordance to all the rules of the war with formations and maneuvers, it eventually resulted in a great massacre, breaking up into many separate fights. Both sides fought to the point of exhaustion and suffered huge losses. Fermor was forced to retreat to the Vistula. The Austrians and French weren't active that year, rebuilding their forces for the next year campaign. Successfully fighting of three great powers, Frederick was at his best. After winning the battles of Rosbo and Leuthen, everyone recognizes his greatness. However, Frederick himself was not in a triumphant mood. These victories were a plaster on his deep bonds. The third year of hostilities greatly exhausted Prussia, which lost almost the entire pick of its army. The Allies did not even think of giving up. Their human and physical resources allowed them to wage a long war. Frederick knew that sooner or later he would be defeated, and only a miracle could save his house from inevitable death.